Hello, welcome again to lecture number 6, where we pick up where we left off due to a technical glitch which hopefully shall never happen again. Alright, so we're talking about sentence derivation. Now, consider how one gets from the lexical items, the three lexical items, they, do, and exist, to arrive at the fully constructed sentence, they do exist. In other words, consider what is known as the derivation of the sentence. It works like this. The operation merge first yields the two-item phrase do exist, which is an auxiliary phrase, formed from the auxiliary do and the verb exist. So you have that auxiliary phrase, do exist. That object, in turn, is then merged with the word they. That should be in quotes or italicized or something. That's the word or lexical item they. Being merged with they, one gets the result they do exist. The result here is a hierarchical structure of phrase within phrase, and a parsing tree illustrates this structure, as you can see there in the illustration. Now, there is an exception, namely a junction, an exception to merge. A junction is the use of conjunctions to string words together. So, for example, this and that, or here and there. Now, there's no evidence that such constructions have a hierarchical form. So the simplest hypothesis is that they're flat, which means that they're not the result of merge. They're the result of something combinatorial, but it's not merge, because merge yields a hierarchical structure. Another example of something flat would be repetition of a single word, as in, I am very, 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 very tired. Now, there's no reason to believe that each use of very in that phrase introduces a new hierarchical level. It seems to be flat. The simplest assumption is that it's flat. Merge yields very narrow span because there are only two constituents. Repetition for emphasis, as in the case of I'm very, 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 very tired, yields broader span, and so does a junction, right? As in this and that, and this and that, and here and there, and everywhere. That's broader. Yeah. So, the upshot here is that the mind is hybrid. Syntax consists of merge, which builds these tree-like structures. But there's also the simpler operation of a junction and repetition for emphasis, each of which forms something apparently flat. Now, the same is evidently true when it comes to social relational cognition. A number of different models can be mentally represented as falling under a single superordinate model, and in that case, one has a relatively flat level. So if you consider the first line here, it represents, it's a mental representation of an authoritarian society, for example. A number of different sectors of society are represented as being controlled by an authority. But notice that there isn't any kind of structural relation among the lower level sectors themselves. They're flat. So the communal sharing, the equality matching, and the market pricing are adjoined. They illustrate a junction rather than hierarchy. Yeah. And there are other possibilities, of course. The second line illustrates another possibility. In this case, there could be three families, each of which is internally structured by communal sharing, while standing in an equality matching relation to each other. And in cases in which one is not precisely aware of the number of families, the mental representation would not have this form. Okay? So presumably, it would have binary span on every level, and that's represented on the third line, where communal sharing is not subscripted, because we don't have any specific number of families in mind. We just know there's a bunch of families, each of which is structured by communal sharing. Now, for Simon, quoting Simon here, quoting Simon, the time required for the evolution of a complex form from simple elements depends critically on the numbers and distribution of potential intermediate stable forms. Now, part of what survival of the fittest means is survival of the stable. The chances of survival are greatly increased when stability is reached quickly. Now, shortness of span means that one can assemble a complex stable form more quickly. As a result, complexity is more likely to evolve when there are stable stages in the development of the organism. So the principle which holds in the case of the derivation of a sentence also holds in the case of biological evolution. And presumably, it also holds in the case of complex social structures. So a social structure with recursive composition is more likely to form. And once it is formed, it's more likely to survive than one which is extremely flat. So quoting Simon again, here's Simon's illustration. Philip assembled his Macedonian empire and gave it to his son, to be later combined with the Persian subassembly and other sub-assemblies, in other words, into Alexander's greater system. Upon Alexander's death, his empire did not crumble to dust, but fragmented into some of the major subsystems that had composed it. So Alexander was able to assemble his empire as easily as he did, which is not to say that it was easy, but what made it possible at all, what made it even feasible or doable, is that there were these large sub-assemblies that already existed. And most of what he was doing was to assemble them, to combine them under an overarching authority. And once Alexander himself was no longer present to coordinate them into a larger grouping, because he died, obviously, once he died, some of the sub-assemblies remained. So this large complex structure was able to form because certain sub-assemblies already existed. And when there was some, when entropy creeped in with the death of Alexander, some of the sub-assemblies survived. Notice that we're talking about something cognitive here. These political entities exist, and they continue to exist because of what goes on in people's minds. It is the recursive structure of social thinking which makes them possible. Connor, as you may recall, noted that apes, including humans, as well as elephants, and also toothed whales, the Odontocetes, which includes dolphins, they all live in relatively large societies. The quickest way to form a mental representation of a large number of individuals is to form a hierarchically organized, in other words, a recursive structure in one's mind. In other words, forming such a representation is like building a watch. One can work more efficiently by building up from sub-assemblies to super-assemblies. And this suggests an hypothesis. Recursive cognition is an adaptation for social cognition in large groups. And this is close to the hypothesis that I was defending in the previous lecture. Namely, that recursive cognition first evolved for processing social information. But now we're also noting that the need to form a mental representation of a large community quickly, the need to form this representation quickly, demands recursively organized thought. In other words, we can now discern the reason for social cognition being recursive in form. What I'm thinking here is that language as a communication device is a Franklin for a cognitive adaptation that originally emerged for the sake of processing social information. And this is the view of Cheney and Seyfarth, and the more I dwell upon it, the more it seems pretty reasonable to me. Now, turning to the issue of problem solving, Simon notes that advancing in stages is practically necessary in order to solve a complex problem. And Simon takes this to be similar to the point that he made about the two watchmakers. It greatly increases efficiency to build up from subassemblies. Here's Simon's illustration. One can crack a safe far more efficiently if there are 3 dials to be manipulated in a certain order, a given order that's known in advance, as opposed to there being a single dial that requires 3 numbers in the right order. Being able to break a problem down into subordinate steps makes it more manageable. Now, Steven Pinker and Ray Jackendoff argue, appealing to Simon, that recursion is probably ubiquitous in thought, given that recursion is practically necessary for any complex problem solving, then you probably find recursion throughout cognition. Quoting Pinker and Jackendoff, as Herbert Simon has pointed out, probably all complex systems are characterized by hierarchical organization. So if recursion is identified with hierarchical decomposition and used as a criterion for identifying some pre-existing cognitive function as a source for exaptation to language, speculations can proliferate unconstrained. And Pinker and Jackendoff might even point to the hypothesis of Cheney and Seyfarth as an illustration of this, the view that language as an organ for communication is derived from language as an adaptation for social cognition. They would say, well, that's probably, the reason that hypothesis appears plausible is probably just because recursion is ubiquitous to thought. And so naturally you're going to find it in social cognition because you're going to find it everywhere. Right? Now, in this context, Pinker and Jackendoff are using the word exaptation to mean the same as Franklin, which was the word that Stephen Jay Gould used for the use of an organ for something other than what it was originally designed for. And of course, natural selection here is the designer. Now, Gould also used the word exaptation, but he used it in a somewhat broader and more ambiguous way than his use of the word Franklin, which is why I prefer the word Franklin. So in other words, Pinker and Jackendoff are saying that it's just too easy to say that language, as an organ for communication, is a Franklin of some recursive cognitive function. After all, it's plausible that problem solving tends to have hierarchical form anyway. And what this means, according to Pinker and Jackendoff, is that recursion is likely to be a general feature of cognition. In other words, thought as such tends to be language-like in structure. And the view that thought generally is language-like in structure and also in its formation is known as the language of thought hypothesis. Herbert Simon's view that complex problem solving is expected to take hierarchical form is at least close to the language of thought hypothesis. Now, Gilbert Harman defended the language of thought hypothesis in 1973. In fact, in some form or other, some variant of the language of thought hypothesis predates Harman. I mean, you find a kind of language of thought hypothesis in Ludwig Wittgenstein's book Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And you even find a kind of language of thought hypothesis in the medieval philosopher William of Ockham. However, be that as it may, the language of thought hypothesis is mainly associated with Jerry Fodor, who defended it at great length, beginning with his book, The Language of Thought. He wrote a book with that title, The Language of Thought, which was first published in 1975. Now, the language of thought hypothesis is the view that thought, or at least a wide range of many forms of thought, consists in the manipulation of sentence-like mental representations. All right, then. So the reason that we have a communication system that has these formal properties, for example, recursion, is because this communication system happens to reflect the structure of our thought. And our thought is recursive. Well, should we dismiss the hypothesis that language, as a communication system, is derived from an inner mental code used for social cognition? In other words, is the hypothesis of Cheney and Seyfarth too narrow? I mean, they say that our recursive abilities originally began with social cognition. Maybe that's too narrow. Maybe our recursive abilities just began with cognition as such. Not necessarily. I think that Fodor and Pinker and Jackendorf may be wrong, because there's another striking similarity between social cognition and language. It's not just recursion, there's something else going on, namely endocentricity. Social cognition and language both exhibit endocentricity. It's not clear that cognition as such exhibits endocentricity. Now, what do I mean by endocentricity? Allow me to explain. There are limits on how lexical items can be combined. I mean, turning to language specifically now. There are limits on how, for example, words can be combined to form phrases. For example, the word the can be combined with a noun, such as table. So you get the table, right? But you cannot combine the with a preposition like for. So you can't say the for. The for is not a phrase. By contrast, the table is a phrase. Now, so far that may seem trivial, but notice that this also applies not just to words or lexical items, it applies to whole phrases. So old book is not a single lexical item, and it's not a single word, it's a phrase. But that phrase functions like a noun. And that's a little odd, that's a little surprising, because even though the phrase contains a noun, it also contains an adjective. But because the phrase functions like a noun, it can combine with a determiner. So, for example, you get a phrase, a more complex phrase, such as the old book, because the is a determiner, or any old book, or each old book. And this is because, even though the word old is an adjective, when you combine it with the word book, you don't get an adjective, you get a noun. In other words, the result of merge is an object which combines as though it were a noun. And this applies to phrases no matter how long they are. So, for example, extremely old book with a leaf pressed between its pages. That phrase combines, just like the single word, book. So, there's part of a phrase which determines the part of speech. And the rest of the phrase is something else. The part of the phrase that determines speech is known as the head. Other parts of the phrase are known as specifier or complement. And just to keep things simple, let's just talk about the complement. So let's contrast head with complement. We'll just ignore specifiers, just to keep it simple. Now, this is a ubiquitous property of language. It even applies to whole sentences. After all, a sentence is a phrase. The head of a declarative sentence, for example, is usually taken to be its tense. And what that means is that a declarative sentence is what's called a tense phrase. Okay? So here you have a sentence. The boy kicks the ball. The head of this phrase is the constituent which determines tense, which is the ending of the word kick. Right. The affix attached to the end of the word kick determines the part of speech of the whole phrase. A yes-no question, at least in English, is taken to be a complementizer phrase. So in the sentence, did you go? Did is the head of the sentence. And did is a complementizer because it introduces the subclause you go. Now, endocentricity also appears in some compound models. It appears in the compound models which exhibit hierarchical structure. So, for example, the relation between waiter and customer is market pricing. But in a way that's surprising, because the relation between waiter and customer includes an authority ranking component. After all, the customer tells the waiter what to do. The customer is an authority over the waiter. But at the same time, you know that the whole thing is market pricing, right? Because it's entered into upon agreement, and it's paid for, right? It's contractual. And yet somehow the whole thing is market pricing, even though there's an authority ranking component. Similarly, even though a judge determining the sentencing of a guilty defendant is exercising market pricing because the punishment has to be proportional to the crime, and the use of proportions is market pricing, nonetheless, everyone naturally sees the predominant relation there as authority ranking. The relation of judge to defendant is an authoritarian relation. In combining the two models in that case, authority ranking stands out as the category of the relevant compound model. So there's a head-complement relation here. In the case of the waiter and the customer, the head is market pricing, and the complement is authority ranking. In the case of the judge and the defendant, it's the other way around. The head is authority ranking, and the complement is market pricing. Now, not only is the head-complement relation intuitively present in some compound models, but the apparent head serves to license the complement, and one finds the same thing in language. The head legitimates the complement. So, here's an example from libertarian society. One way to characterize libertarianism is that everything should be market pricing. And yet, strictly speaking, that's not quite right. It's not that everything in a libertarian society would be market pricing. Because, to take a rather colorful example, surely there could be two people in a libertarian society who negotiate some sort of game or some sort of sexual kink in which one commands and the other obeys. And that would be authoritarian. But would that violate the norms of libertarian society? Of course not. Because the negotiation between the two certifies the relation as market pricing. Right? So in that case, the head is market pricing, and the complement would be authority ranking. And the fact that market pricing is the head licenses the authority ranking and makes it acceptable. The authority ranking counts as market pricing because it is subordinate to a market pricing constituent. So it's almost as though there's a kind of cognitive blind spot when we think about interpersonal relations. So a libertarian who's familiar with relational models theory might say with great confidence, everything in society should be market pricing. Now, when considering the examples of the diner and the waiter, or the people who play some kind of domination game, the libertarian does not see those as contrary to libertarian principles. In other words, even though there's an authority-ranking constituent, the entire structure, the entire relation, counts as market pricing. It's as though there's some part of the mind that can only see the market pricing shell, and it's blind to the authority-ranking contents. It's blind to what's inside that shell. And you find the same thing in language. That's what's really interesting, that you find something closely parallel to this in language. In determining whether to merge a determiner with the phrase book on the table, it's as though there's part of the mind that only sees the word book, and it doesn't see any other constituent of the phrase. So, in merging the word your, which is a determiner, by the way, in merging the word your to the noun phrase book on the table, it's as if the merge operation is only sensitive to the word book. To speak of your book on the table is to speak of your book. It's not to speak of your table, except by accident. And other logical possibilities, such as you're on or you're the, are ungrammatical. It is book alone which is the target of merge. So it's not just recursion that one finds in social cognition and language both. It's also endocentricity, which one finds in both. And apparent convergent evolution, which perhaps suggests that the computation merge was originally for social cognition, and only later was it Franklined, or Franklined, I don't know. Only later was it used as a Franklin in a communication system, and only in human beings. That actually seems pretty reasonable to me, but here's an objection. It's possible that endocentricity is simply the result of efficient computation, and this would explain why endocentricity pops up in different systems, but without actually revealing anything about evolutionary connections. We've already encountered this notion of minimal search. Grammatical movement, now this should sound really familiar, grammatical movement prefers the most superordinate level at which an appropriate object can be found. In other words, search begins at the top of a structure, the top of a tree structure, and it works its way down. But it stops as soon as it can. It doesn't bother going to a subordinate level if it can find something serviceable at a higher structural level. Notice that there's a similar superficiality in endocentricity. It is the most superordinate constituent of a phrase which serves as the head of the phrase. In other words, it is the most superordinate constituent which determines part of speech. And this suggests that endocentricity might be a result of minimal search. In other words, it's just a byproduct of computational efficiency. That's what Chomsky thinks, or that's what he finds plausible. Here's a quote from Chomsky. When you have a structure of the form head, complement, that kind of construction, then headedness is a triviality. In other words, endocentricity is a triviality because it's just the result of minimal search. And you already have minimal search in grammatical movement, so we already know that it's there. If the element that you formed, the head complement structure, if that's going to participate in further combinatorial operations, in other words, if merge acts upon it, then some information about the phrase is relevant. And the simplest way to find the information, in other words, minimal search, will be to take one of the two objects, in other words, either the head or the rest of it. Well, one of them has no information. In other words, the complement has no information, because you have to find its head. You have to find the head of the complement. And that is too deep down. So you find the other one. So the trivial consequence of an optimization procedure, in other words, the most efficient procedure, a trivial consequence of that is, in the case of head complement, you just take the head. So when Chomsky speaks of head XP or head complement, he means a structure of this sort that we've talked about already. Right? One where you have a superordinate gamma and a subordinate alpha beta. Given that the search is minimal, the system will see gamma, and as soon as it sees gamma, it stops searching. The result of the search will be, this object is gamma. And that result will then determine how the object can be merged with another object. And this is efficient in the sense that there's as little searching as possible. The searching is as lazy as possible, in other words. It doesn't use any unnecessary energy. Now, the same thing seems to be happening in interpersonal cognition. In social relational cognition, we find the same thing. A corporation may have a very authoritarian structure internally, but that's acceptable in a libertarian society, given that one agrees to work for the corporation in the first place. The agreement is market pricing, and that market pricing constituent licenses the entire corporate structure, even though internally it may be quite tyrannical. So that's head and complement. The head is market pricing, and the complement is authority ranking. And consider a different example. Consider a medieval monarchy. A medieval monarchy is categorized as authority ranking. Everyone knows that medieval social structures were authoritarian, right? Life in the Middle Ages was very authoritarian. The king and the pope were always telling you what to do, right? But on the other hand, there must have been other relational models that appeared on subordinate levels. But when you categorize the entire structure, those subordinate models don't count. It's only the superordinate one that counts. Minimal search may even extend to how animals search for food. Now, in the article by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, as you may recall, they discussed minimal search outside the domain of language. On page 1578 of their article, they discuss possible investigation, scientific investigation, and this is a quote from their article, in the domain of spatial navigation and foraging, where problems of optimal search are relevant. For example, elegant studies of insects, birds, and primates reveal that individuals often search for food by an optimal strategy. In other words, a strategy that involves minimal distances, recall of locations searched, and kinds of objects retrieved. They go on to note that only after a concerted, multidisciplinary attack on the problems of language evolution, paralleling 40 years of optimal foraging research, will we learn whether such similarities are more than superficial. So perhaps we find endocentricity out of language simply because mental computations tend to be efficient, in other words, minimal, and not for any reason that's specifically related to evolutionary origins. However, there's another explanation that's consistent with saying that recursion was originally an adaptation for social cognition. You remember from the experiments on baboons conducted by Cheney and Seyfarth that baboons will attach greater importance to a superordinate instance of authority ranking than they do to a subordinate instance of authority ranking. Now that looks like endocentricity. If so, then it's easy to see why endocentricity in social cognition would have evolved. A superordinate social structure involves larger number of individuals than does a subordinate social structure. So endocentricity may have evolved simply because of the greater importance of facts involving larger numbers of individuals. And I view this as a really interesting alternative to that proposed by Chomsky on endocentricity. Chomsky is saying that endocentricity may simply result from minimal search, and minimal search is simply efficient computation. Here's another possibility. Endocentricity is found in language because language is an offshoot of social cognition. And endocentricity is found in social cognition because the superordinate social structure is more important than the subordinate one. That's a Darwinian explanation. Right? The superordinate social structure is more important because it involves a larger number of individuals. And so endocentricity in social cognition has a straightforwardly Darwinian explanation. The cognitive language faculty was specialized later in communication. In other words, it's used as a Franklin in communication. And it carried endocentricity along with it. And that's why you have endocentricity in language. It's just an offshoot of social relational cognition. I find that to be a pretty exciting hypothesis. I don't know anyone who suggested it before. Now, sorry about having to divide this lecture into 2 videos. Hopefully I'll get all of this online. Of course, if you're hearing me, that means I did. Okay? Now, if you have any questions, please contact me by email. If you have a proposed paper topic, please let me know. I want you to be thinking about possible topics for papers. If there's something that you read for this course or heard in lecture that you found kind of intriguing, please consider writing a paper about that. The more you find the topic interesting, the more likely it is that you'll write a really great paper. And let me know about the topic in advance. Thank you very much, and bye for now.